Shabbat Shalom. I have a helper this morning. So we find ourselves celebrating Men's Club Shabbat. Thank you to the Men's Club for all of their leadership this morning. And we also find ourselves happy to have a scholar in residence with us this weekend. For those of you that don't know, the Mark A. Siegel Scholar in Residence program was named to a very dedicated member of Beth Torah. Mark had been an active member from 1977 until his passing in 2002. Mark was so very inspired by education and learning that he devoted his life to it. As a teacher and a publisher, and by being active in Jewish adult educational programs, it was not enough that he loved what he learned. He wanted everyone to feel as passionate about learning as he did. His goal was simple. He wanted to offer different educational opportunities to as many congregants as possible, in the hope that something would be available to please everyone's tastes. And because of that, we are so glad that you are all here. Our scholar in residence this morning is Dr. Vanessa Oakes. Dr. Oakes is a dynamic speaker. It's true, I heard her last night. Educator, award-winning author, and ordained rabbi. She is a professor in the Department of Religious and Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. Her books include Inventing Jewish Ritual, Sarah Laughed, The Jewish Dream Book, and Safe and Sound, Protecting Your Child in an Unpredictable World. Today, Dr. Oakes will present the Devar Torah, bringing together Torah's text with ritual theory. As the weekend progresses, Dr. Oakes will speak on Jewish food, eating as a spiritual practice. She will ask us to consider our own Jewish food rules as part of the wisdom passed down from family, and the wisdom gleaned from their individual lives. This evening, she will discuss contemporary Haggadah, Passover rituals, and new Jewish rituals that have taken root in the last 30 years. I wish you all a stimulating and rewarding day, absorbing the knowledge of this year's scholar and residence. Dr. Oakes?
Thank you, Rabbi. And I'm very honored to speak with you today, speak with you this Shabbat in honor of Mr. Siegel's memory. This Shabbat, Shabbat HaChodesh, we've read an additional biblical passage, Exodus 12, 1 through 20. As someone who studies Jewish rituals over time, I find it significant as it is the first time we hear about a Passover-ish ritual. Early aspects of the Passover ritual, we know, will surely strike us familiar in these passages. But when we read this text, it's important to trace elements that have dropped away and elements that will be added, not just words and actions which together constitute liturgy, but also the moods and motivations as well. Historical occurrences, changes of place, influences of other cultures, political considerations, theological developments, and more, all have changed Jewish ritual observance in actual practice among all denominations, and such considerations continue to do so in the present. And I can assure you, in the future they will as well. In this way, our rituals do not remain far off in heaven, impossible to follow or comprehend. Our rituals remain alive. And that's a good thing. And yes, the ritual that we embraced just last year, the one is now the one that we refer to as traditional. This text does not tell us what our ancestors actually did. Let me repeat that. Even though in the text it says the people did, just as Moses and God told them to do so, we have no idea. And let us stop to note that the Torah, from a scholarly vantage, our sacred text, is not a history book. and it's not an ethnographic account, nor is it archaeological evidence. Our sacred text does not document. Granted, it may document what Jewish leaders and sages hoped that our people would remember, cherish, believe, and do. And it certainly documents what the elite wished people would not do. But we don't know if actual men and women performed the rituals that the ancient Israelites were commanded to observe precisely as they were described, or at all. We cannot assume that our ancestors were more punctilious in their practices or less creative in interpretation than we are, even though some members of our tribe often refer to our ancestors as being perfectly pious, and even if in Midrash we see references to pieties that could never have taken place, Sarah lighting Sabbath candles before the Shabbat, or Moses sitting and learning in a yeshiva. Not. After all, these are our ancestors, and we are the people who eat kosher in and eat treif out. We are the people who recall having driven to shul and parking a few blocks away and walking the rest. We are the people who say they observe Shiva, meaning 7, for 1 day or 3 days. We are the people who buy Halloween and Thanksgiving decorations on sale and then use them the next year for our sukkahs. You gotta love us. So there are many unanswered questions. Were the practices that were presented in the Torah in this portion as newly instituted by God and Moses so very new? The text tells us the Israelites did as they were commanded. Did they? When did a Passover practice actually become consistent? Did the Israelite leaders and parents succeed in transmitting the social and spiritual attitudes the Passover practices were supposed to inculcate? We don't know. We do know something that's quite surprising, and that there is, and here it is. I find this incredibly cool, and that's that there's a biblical precedent for an interfaith Seder. Again, not that it happened, but there's a scriptural precedent. So remember Jethro, the priest of Midian, who was Moses' father-in-law. He's portrayed, when we meet him, we met him already, he's portrayed as hosting a Passover-like meal. When Yitro hears about all that the God of Moses did for the children of Israel, he blessed God, the priest of Midian, he blessed God, he acknowledges the power of God, and here's the super Sedery part, he makes a sacrifice to the God of Moses, he invites Aaron and all the elders of Israel, and together they partake of a meal before God. That's a pretty cool thing to think about. So if we were to look ahead at the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Talmud, which we're not going to do, we are going to look at further passages in Torah. We can trace ruptures and continuities that allow us to imagine how remembered stories of Passover practice layered into a people's religious imagination, no matter what actually transpired, would find their way into a coalescing festival. And finally, beginning in the 9th and 10th centuries, into an ever-changing Haggadah, which we'll speak about tonight. This Shabbat, when we look at the early elements of the Passover ritual and the Passover chain of memory, we recall that they do not even begin in Exodus with the enslaved Israelites and Moses' "let my people go." Rather, Passover begins in Genesis with Abraham, who has already set forth on his sacred journey away from the home of his idol-keeping family and toward a land promised by the one God who has spoken to him. Abraham receives a night vision, and it concludes with a ritual marking their covenant. God then foreshadows a terrifying future for Abraham's descendants. Says God, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not their own, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. That's the bad news. But God also offers good news of future comeuppance and consolation. I will execute judgment on the nation they serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. God's flaming torch seals the covenant. The exile and slavery, followed by eventual justice and divine deliverance that are introduced in Abraham's encounter with God, will become recurring points of reference in the Jewish narrative. All of these themes, in addition to God stepping into history as a response to comprehending human suffering, will find their way into our own Passover observance. From a biblical perspective, then, and mark my words, there is no true festival of Passover, no single account of how it used to be done originally when it was right. There are multiple variations of Passover rituals found in many books of the Bible. Whether these variations are forgotten or remembered, discarded or saved, they are all symbolically present in the meal the Haggadah liturgy will orchestrate. On the verge of their departure from Egypt, Moses and Aaron are told to relay to the Israelite families that they must sacrifice a perfect yearling lamb at twilight on the eve of the 14th day of Nisan, smearing its blood on their doors with branches of hyssop. Lamb's blood will be the sign of the angel of death to pass over their houses when the firstborn children of the Egyptians are slain. It matters that this food practice involves the participation of the whole family hovering watchfully over a lamb. This festival is initially set in a domestic context. Without gathering in a public place, without the oversight of a priest, families or combined households are to roast their lamb over the fire and eat them with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Hardly a Seder, but it's beginning to sound familiar. And there's a dress code for this meal. Clothes secured for travel, sandals, and a staff ready in hand, even though the hasty departure won't commence until the morrow. The dress is appropriate for the situation, but in its being slightly preemptive, it is also a symbol that is worn, something that we understand. Many of us are wearing a symbol today. This symbolic dress protects that this meal marks the protection of the endangered firstborn sons in the houses of the Israelites and the change of identity to come from slave to sojourner to spiritual journeyer. This one-time ritual is called the Passover of Egypt. Even before this hurried meal is consumed and the horrible night of waiting to depart begins, the Israelites learn something so very curious. For the rest of time, they will be remembering a ritual they have yet to perform and a liberation which they have yet to experience. Without knowing how harrowing their escape will be or what freedom will even feel like, they must prepare to ritualize the unimaginable in order to perpetuate its memory. This anticipated practice of a less hurried symbolic meal is called Pesach Hadorot, Passover of the generations, fusing one ritual for now and one for time to come presages, as the scholar David Stern explains, and I quote, the dramatic collapsing of time, past, present, and future, that, as we shall see, marks much of the inner dynamics of both the Seder and the Haggadah as they subsequently develop. The Passover of generations, celebrated in being brought out from Egypt, will be marked by 7 days of eating unleavened bread in a leaven-free house. Something we didn't hear about before, the leaven-free house. Oh gosh, where did that idea ever come from? It is also referred to as the Feast of Matzot, calling up a central element of the spring wheat harvest. Mount Sinai is the setting for the next Passover narration, again, the 14th day of Nisan. And now we have a celebration requiring no work, as befits a sacred occasion. The day requires gifts to the Lord. We are left to imagine how Passover is marked, or not, through the years of wandering. And then we come to a detailed description of the first Passover celebrated in the land promised to Abraham's returned ancestors, and accumulations of new distinctions mark the return home. Men need to be circumcised so they are eligible to offer the Passover sacrifice. God stops providing the manna by now, the tedious menu of the desert years, and on Passover, a new diet is introduced, not just unleavened bread and parched grain, but local foods, the produce of bounty, a bounty meriting thanksgiving. So you can imagine the list. Clean for Passover, go to Tom Thumb, get circumcised, go to the health food store and get local foods. New elements are introduced in the book of Numbers, which assumes everyone knows all the rules and rituals of Passover. And that's a big element there that stays in the tradition all the way through rabbinic literature. The assumption that everybody knows the story and everybody knows all the rules and rituals. In the book of Numbers, there's an introduction of something I would call the second chance policy. If you can't meet the obligation of a Passover offering on the right day of Nisan, either because you were in a state of impurity caused by contact with the dead or because you've been on a long journey away, you're given an opportunity to make it up a month later. Should you fail to make the offering this time, you're cut off from your kin. If not for periods in Jewish history, ancient and modern, during which interest in Passover flagged, one might be tempted to connect this threat of excision from the group for failure to observe Passover to the high current rate of Jewish attendance at some form of Passover Seder, which is claimed to be as high as 90% in both America and Israel. I'm going to skip through Deuteronomy. Trust me, it's in Deuteronomy. And then I want to move to temple practice at the temple. When we have a temple, when our people in Scripture has a temple, Passover becomes the occasion for large-scale revivals. We don't have much experience, so picture big tent revivals, pick major gathering. Upon the return from the Babylonian exile, the national aspect of the celebration, now marked by magnificent pageantry, continues to trump domestic festivity. So once we had a holiday of domestic festivity, now everyone is, or in theory, everyone is leaving home, coming together, going to Jerusalem, and essentially having a barbecue event, like a kosher chili cook-off event in Jerusalem. But the important part here, is the royal extravaganza, sponsored by Kings Hezekiah and Josiah. In Hezekiah's reign, a great crowd assembles, happens to be a month late. The second chance policy is invoked. And the temple celebration lasts not 1 but 2 weeks. I think this is not going to make a comeback, the 2-week Passover. And then the Levites slaughter thousands upon thousands of bull and sheep. My vegan and vegetarian friends and my low cholesterol friends, we do not see this making a comeback either. We're told, rejoicing unrestrained as this, has not happened since the time of Solomon. Josiah affirms his power when he sponsors Passover as a national unity holiday, assuring that all of Israel, those from the north and those of the south, keep the dramatic and efficiently orchestrated outdoor communal meal. And this is occasion for the Majesty's largesse not to go unnoticed. He donates 30,000 lambs and goats, that's a lot, that's a lot, for Passover offerings, and 3,000 cattle. Okay, whatever. With singers at their stations, the Levites do double duty as chefs. You can picture like a TV show on the Food Network. The Levite, we sing, we cook, we bless. They roasted the Passover sacrifice in fire, while the sacred offerings they cooked in pots, cauldrons, and pans, and conveyed them with dispatch to all the people. I guess they were also waitstaff. The appraisal, once again, is hyperbolic. Since the time of Samuel, no Passover like that has ever been kept in Israel. None of the kings of Israel had kept a Passover like the one kept by Hosea. It's hard for me to imagine this in our day, but don't you remember year after year pictures of Obama's Seder? What it means for, sort of a quirky kind of thing, and maybe this harks back to Yitro. What does it mean when a non-Jewish leader of our nation holds a kosher-style Seder in his residence, inviting his Jewish colleagues, some of his wife's African-American Jewish colleagues, and using, of course, which Haggadah? Let us all say together, the Maxwell House. The Maxwell House. When Jonathan Safran Foer's Haggadah came out, there was a lobbying effort to introduce that into the Obama Seder, and the chiefs of staff and chief of protocol all agreed, no, they had to stick with the traditional, the Maxwell House. It will fall upon, as we know, and now I'll come to a conclusion, it falls upon the rabbinic sages to forge new practices so that continuity with the past can be maintained, even in exile, and so that encounters with a text can be a continual source of ongoing revelation. Through study, deliberations, and debates, our rabbis fabricate an alternative to sacrifice for experiencing connection to God, an alternative to national assembly, an alternative to pilgrimage. What else could stimulate telling the story of Exodus and the redemption? What could protect listeners from feeling abandoned by God in times of exile and despair? What the rabbis create is a symbolic service of study and ritualized dining held at the new altar, our dining room table. Not the synagogue, not the study house, but one's own home. What would continue to evoke the overwhelming feeling of nationhood and connectedness that people have experienced as pilgrims assembling together would have to be their awareness, and now ours, that a new Passover observance is taking place simultaneously in other houses, newly authenticated and rabbinically approved, an assembly of the imagination. The rabbis' tactics were brilliant, but their solutions did not come elegantly and all of a piece overnight. Ritual challenges responding with resilience to loss and trauma rarely do. There is dig-in-your-heels debate, personality conflict, power plays, ritual trial and error, and the large role of people. Real people in real homes who are making decisions about who gets to come and who doesn't, who's cooking this year and who's not, who's leading and who's never going to lead again, how long things went last year and how long they're not going to go this year. I can only imagine that the creativity and variety that we now know has long gone on. It has taken a long time until the Seder has reached the coalescence of today. And I assure you, and I think we all assure each other, that there will be new coalescences of how Passover is observed in the future. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom. Yasher koach.